welcome back to Civic Concord, a podcast where we share information, highlight important topics, and hear directly from people involved in town government. My name is Megan Zammuto, and I'm joined today by Jason Bulger, who's the director of the Concord Municipal Light Plant and also the interim chief information officer in Concord. Hi, Jason.
Hello.
So today we're going to try out a new format. Instead of the standard interview that we've been doing over the last 6 episodes, we're going to have a conversation and provide an update on a topic that I think I'm asked about more than any other topic, which is cell service. So this topic has a long history in Concord that predates really Jason and I, both of our time in town. But today we wanted to provide some history on why coverage is a challenge in town, what has been tried to fix it, and what is underway right now and what's coming up. So this, for those that are kind of clicking on this podcast here, you already know that why cell coverage matters. A couple of the things that we hear most about is public safety. I hear from folks all the time about frustration trying to reach loved ones in the center and other places in town. We hear from our first responders. We hear from the school community. There are a lot of reasons why making sure reliable coverage is critical in our community. We hear from the business community about their frustrations with point of sale, customer frustrations. I must have heard about it a few times at Ag Day when folks were trying to pay with their credit cards outside. And I know the select board was asked a lot of questions at their booth as well. So generally, the residents are contacting us oftentimes. And with major events, we have several different events in town, especially the 250th, that we just had a major celebration, and that relied heavily on cell coverage. For that event, we were able to bring in some temporary units to boost coverage. And we heard from a lot of residents and members of the community that was a great help. Could we keep them here all the time? And unfortunately, we cannot, but I am happy to, later in this episode, give an update of some of the things that are coming up to hopefully improve coverage.
Yeah. And I think historically there's been a challenge, getting infrastructure set up here in Concord, and I can kind of walk folks through that and explain what the challenges have been. Historically, when cell towers started popping up, I think there was a concern about the effect they would have on a very historic place like Concord. People didn't want to see large cell towers, dotting the hillside and some of the rural areas of Concord. And so there was a concerted effort to, create a bylaw that would restrict the location where these towers could be placed. And at the time, cell towers were towers. They were hundreds of feet tall. They were large, and they were not very sightly. So that was probably a very valid concern. And so there was a local bylaw added, Section 7.8, and passed in 1998. And it had several restrictions on where these towers could go, and also created an overlay map that also said, in addition to certain setbacks from, houses or schools, it also could only be placed in these certain areas. And that map was, I think, developed with the notion that cell towers could be placed in a couple strategic areas out of sight and provide good coverage for everywhere. And at the time, we're looking at 1G or 2G at the most. And so you're only worrying about data or about voice calls, not data. And that requires far less bandwidth and throughput than a data connection. And we also had less density, probably population density, and not as much of a need to get it into closer areas where people were inhabiting.
So it's kind of designed for the technology and the population at the time, which has significantly evolved.
Exactly. And so what the need is now is to get the infrastructure closer to where it's needed so it can provide good coverage. And to do that, you either need to have towers, in your close rural areas, or you need to have other solutions that can either be hidden or smaller. So those are some of the challenges we've had. And, I think that I'll remind people that the FCC has the Telecommunications Act of 1996 and the FCC standards and some of the declaratory rulings that state, that a local community cannot restrict cell towers for certain things, and one of those is potential health impacts. And so I think that was another reason that motivated the town to do something and sort of clarify what the restrictions on cell infrastructure were. And then I think that The other thing that's been a challenge, I think, historically is that with the bylaw and the approvals that are necessary to get cell infrastructure sited comes a lot of challenges historically in Concord. And so the developers and the carriers themselves, come into an environment and have had challenges getting through certain approvals, even when there has been broad public support. And I think it historically might have, encouraged them to not persist in Concord because they didn't think they were going to be very fruitful.
Right. And I think in a lot of communities, there are private partnerships with carriers, tower companies, and landowners, property owners. And there are some here as well. And I think in a lot of places, the municipality doesn't necessarily have to get as involved in the siting and working to add infrastructure. But because of our kind of the reputation and some of the market reality and the past denials, we are at a point where we have to kind of act because of the public safety concern, because of the concern from our community members. And, it hasn't always been such a challenge here with some different carriers. There was a Sprint, not a tower, infrastructure in the steeple at the Tricon Church. They operated for 25 years. And so, for folks that had that carrier, they maybe didn't have so much of an issue. But that site went offline after the T-Mobile merger. And there was an effort for Verizon, who's considering going into that location. So that was a private negotiation that was going on for a few years, but there was no agreement reached. The town has looked at a few other municipal locations over the years, and one is the Keyes Road campus. There have been requests for proposals. There has been some site analysis done. There's some challenges with that site. It's in the historic district. You could possibly see some infrastructure from our National Historical Park, which could be a concern. But there are a lot of good things about that location too. You could get some coverage, but the main thing we really need for infrastructure is interest from a carrier. And so, we can think it's a good site on our end, but if a company doesn't want to go there, that can be tricky. And so, that had been pursued and reviewed, but it hasn't been pursued lately because we're hearing from the industry that it's really not a top location because of some of the siting concerns. And so we have been looking at other municipal sites, of course, and we'll talk about the current project at the Umbrella that is moving forward. But there was, this isn't the first time we're looking at that site. We looked at it in 2017. There was a request for proposal that was put out, and it was awarded to Verizon, but there were a lot of concerns in the neighborhood and beyond. And so that ultimately didn't move forward. But that is a location that we're feeling good about these days.
Yeah. And I think that you've seen in the last couple of years the select board really focusing on cell as an issue, and that has come down to staff through the town manager's goals and support and resources to try to get that going. The town does have an RF consultant that they use for advice and analysis, and several staff members that are kind of drawn in at various times to try to grease the wheels and encourage carriers to show interest in certain sites or help with negotiations or discussions in other areas. And, a lot of work has been done and significant resources expended to try to do that, which is usually a private issue and solution. Right. Here in Concord, I think that because of the residents really reaching out to their elected representatives, it's kind of come down to staff to try to help solve some of these problems as well. If you'll remember, a couple of years ago, we had a listening session and survey that went out. We were trying to get feedback from people, hear from them on what their challenges and struggles have been, and also hear from them what their concerns are, and, get a survey from people in terms of what they're willing to tolerate and for what they see or what they experience. And that was really well attended. We got a lot of good feedback, and it, kind of renewed our efforts to explore some solutions, and maybe some that had been explored before, but really try again with a fresh set of eyes, and also see if the community was, more receptive now that cell coverage has really become kind of like a basic need for a lot of people in terms of access to critical resources.
Yeah, and I think that listening session has been very helpful, and it is on our website. If you go to our cell page on our Town of Concord website, You can both watch the recording, and you can also take a look at the slideshow. I think you can see the results of the survey as well. And that's where we also put the project updates that we're going to talk about today. Those are also on our page. But if you wanted kind of more of a deeper dive about the zoning and look at some of the visuals, like the map, that would be a good place to check out.
Yeah.
And sorry.
I was just going to say, I think it's worth kind of running through some of the projects that are going on now, and we can talk about some of those. I think the first thing that we'll mention is Concord Center. Concord Center does have good coverage for T-Mobile customers, as there is, an antenna in the First Parish Church. But the downtown area is a challenge. We've got towers on Emerson Hospital. We've got towers in Lincoln. We've got towers at the wastewater treatment plant in Bedford Street. But, that leaves the downtown area for non-T-Mobile customers kind of spotty. And one thing that may help is there's some interest by carrier AT&T to add some small cell in the kind of near the library along Sudbury Road, and there's 2 sites there hoping to put some small cell. Now, small cell is a way to augment cellular coverage for people. Carriers do not like to use it exclusively. They like it to really supplement what we call macro cell coverage, which means your basic phone calls and data. The small cell is typically used for more throughput in highly dense areas where you might see a lot of people, a lot of population needing to get high speed. Some carriers also use it to actually provide internet service to people because it doesn't have as far of a reach, maybe only several hundred feet, but it can provide faster speed in that small area. The town does have a small cell policy that was developed and approved by the Select Board in 2022. And that does create and kind of provide a clear process for these small cell applications. And it is a challenge in Concord, and we'll kind of get to that a little bit later.
And so that's one project that we have that we're excited to see move forward in Concord Center. And I just reached out to them the other day. The Select Board approved the application on June 30th, and it's September now, and now that everyone's back from the summer and we're getting a lot of questions, I asked, how's that going? When can we expect installation? And they reminded me that these things take time and there is a lot of permitting, and this was just kind of one step in the approval process. But they are hoping to have construction of those sometime in 2026. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that goes as quick as possible to help for those customers. Yeah. We're also moving forward, as I mentioned earlier, at the Umbrella Center, our Umbrella Art Center at 40 Stowe Street. And so that building is actually a municipal building that we lease out to the Umbrella. And we are looking to put infrastructure up in the cupola, which is space that's not used by the Umbrella. And so we have considered this a few times. As I said, we looked at it in 2017. We also put out a request for proposals in 2024, but at that time we did not receive any acceptable proposals. So we worked with our RF consultant, kind of went back to the drawing board to adjust it and look into it a little bit more. And then we issued a second request for proposals, maybe not second, in April of 2025. And so that was awarded in June of 2025 to Verizon Wireless. And so this summer has been a lot of site visits. We've been working closely with the Umbrella to coordinate these visits, to look at how the construction plans would be developed. They're taking measurements. They're looking to, how they're going to run the wires to have the least amount of impact onto the operation in the building. And we are working now to finalize the lease. So we just sent that over to them, and we're looking forward to continuing that partnership with Verizon and also looking for hopefully some improvement at some point in 2026.
Yeah. And another area that we've been looking at where there's a bit of a gap, especially for some carriers, is the Route 2, and the Concord Carlisle High School area. There's definitely a gap over there. As I mentioned, Lincoln has some infrastructure that helps, and Emerson is also along Route 2, but between them there is a significant gap, and that extends to the school and the Alcott School and some other areas, and then obviously to the downtown area. But solutions in the downtown area won't actually extend to this area, so it's important to consider this separately. And I think that one of the big things that we've done is look at the landfill site, and that was really after looking at maybe the school property itself, which seemed to be situated pretty well because of the elevation. We also looked at a parcel right next to the school owned by Concord Academy, But after consideration and for various factors, the carriers and then those parties could not come to a deal, and so we needed to continue to look elsewhere.
Yeah, we've had success here at the landfill. We issued a request for proposals, and we have an executed lease with Wireless Edge Towers, and their proposal really stood out in that they have worked with many communities and have had a lot of success in a lot of different places. So we're looking forward to continuing to work with them. And this tower is going to hold up to 4 carriers. So what they're doing now is making sure they have agreements with various carriers in the form of a sublease so that they can move forward with their permitting project. So they are still full steam ahead, and we check in with them regularly to make sure that they're on track, and that will eventually have a local permitting process. And this webpage, and we'll be doing a lot of public outreach because we know so many people are interested in this and want to weigh in and have their voices heard. And so we'll make sure folks are aware when those meetings are on the schedule. The third area we've been looking at is West Concord. And last summer we did a site analysis with our RF consultant to look at really municipal parcels again, because of the way our zoning is, it's challenging in some other spots, but we're going to be working on that as well. But we've been looking, okay, where can we put some infrastructure on town-owned land that could move the needle? So in August, we did a site visit to the clock tower at Harvey Wheeler. And one thing I've been saying, a fun part of this job is getting to climb up in cupolas and clock towers with our consultants and take a look. There's a beautiful view from the clock tower in Harvey Wheeler and kind of a steep ladder. But we checked it out, and the space actually looks okay for infrastructure. But one challenge, and I think there was an article in the Bridge about that this week, where we need to have some ground-mounted equipment or equipment that can be easily accessed by the carrier. So if there's some maintenance that's needed, they can't really need to be reliant on town staff, facility staff to get into a building and access their materials. So it's usually outside in some type of, kind of enclosed shed or, some type of protected area. And that site is very tight. So there wasn't an obvious spot for that type of equipment. So we did also look out at Rideout Park to assess feasibility. And one model that's been successful in other communities is to look at flagpoles and to make a monopole for infrastructure and turn it into a flagpole. So the look of it aesthetically is not very disruptive. So that's something we're looking at for that area. But we are continuing to explore sites and gather carrier interest, which is a key ingredient here before we move forward with any requests for proposals. Beyond our specific project citing, there are some other initiatives that have been moving forward to further this. We're really trying to look at this as a multi-pronged effort. And if you recall at town meeting, we had Article 26 that allowed for leases up to 30 years on municipal property. And so we already had a bylaw that allowed for leases up to 30 years for municipal buildings, which is how we're doing the lease for the cupola at the umbrella. But we didn't have the same language for property. So we're running into some challenges with the landfill, how we can, make it so that carriers could really invest in the land because it costs a lot of money for the installation and the development and construction of this infrastructure. So that was one small, kind of small update that is, in line with our goal of making it easier to have cell service in town. And also the planning board is doing a zoning review. And so they're looking at our current zoning bylaws. They're trying to update it for modern needs, and they're aiming for having some articles for the 2026 town meeting.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important here to bring up small cell and explain a little bit more about how that works and when it can be a good solution and when it can't be a good solution.
This comes up a lot.
Yeah. So small cell is really just a smaller version of a cell tower. It can be mounted on a building. It could be mounted on top of a pole or a street light. It's typically in that 30 to 50 foot high height. And again, only provides coverage for a pretty small, limited area of a few hundred feet to maybe 1,000 feet. It's not going to solve the problem in any one area. Typically, we see these in very dense urban areas in big cities where they have a lot of people crammed in and a lot of people who have cell phones and other wireless devices that need to pass a lot of throughput. And the traditional cell infrastructure that, allows for thousands of people to make a phone call does not allow for thousands of people to all stream video in real time. And so these small cells really help augment that. Small cell, as we've been told by many carriers, is not a replacement for macro coverage. And, macro coverage is what you think of when you think of a tower, or as you mentioned, a flagpole, or any other infrastructure that's meant to be high and large and provide kind of base coverage for a large area. So small cells are not, they're basically the opposite of that. The good news for small cell is that permitting is faster. The FCC has a protocol. The town now has a small cell policy. So we have a roadmap for how these things get out there. I think one of the other challenges is that Concord has another bylaw that says that we're going to underground all of our utility poles in the town. And that is definitely makes it a challenge when it comes to siting small cell. Our most dense areas in the downtown of West Concord and Concord Center are all underground right now for utilities, which means there is no infrastructure in the right of way for carriers to connect things. There are some streetlights. Streetlights were obviously installed at a time where we didn't anticipate needing to put small cell, so we don't have the requisite conduit or even power that would allow us to put antennas on these. And the decorative streetlights that were meant to harken back to an earlier time were not designed to have anything added to them. And these streetlights can cost between $10,000 and $20,000 a piece and have a useful life of, say, 20 to 50 years. So I think that there are some infrastructure constraints in terms of where small cell can go. We are trying to get creative with that without violating the bylaw on requiring undergrounding, but there are definitely limited areas. The areas where it would be easiest to add small cell are the places where we don't really need small cell. And so that has been a challenge to date. There are other communities that have looked at creating their own small cell network that they can lease to carriers, and Wellesley is an example of that. We've talked to the folks at Wellesley, and again, different situation in terms of undergrounding and the infrastructure that they had. But it's definitely something that we can look at, especially since we have an MLP here in Concord and have a good relationship with CMLP. I happen to know some people who work there. They're very supportive of the town's interests and goals. And so I think that, there is a long-term possibility to see some small cell help in some areas. But again, the carriers drive that. If carriers aren't interested, we're not going to spend the money to create the opportunity for that. And the carriers have told us directly that until they have macro coverage and can see a gap in terms of needing small cell, that's their preference. So their preference is to get this basic coverage. And their motivation is really customer satisfaction. If you're making a phone call, or you can't even make a phone call, but if you make a phone call and it keeps getting dropped, you're frustrated and you're not going to be happy with your service. If your streaming goes a little slow, that's a concern, but it probably isn't going to cause you to cancel your service. So they're trying to really address the dissatisfied customers who can't make calls or who can't make and keep reliable calls. And so, until their priorities shift, then all we can do is try to plan for thinking about having that infrastructure ready to go so that when people are interested or technology changes or the town's needs change, that we're positioned well to address that. So for example, when we replace the streetlights, we will do so with replacement units that can accommodate infrastructure to be mounted on it and have the wiring and the power available for, say, small cell or downtown Wi-Fi or something like that.
I think to close out here, we want to make sure the community knows that this is a moment in time. We want to make sure we're communicating what we're working on, and that people can continue to check back on our town webpage to stay informed about how to participate in upcoming local permitting meetings so that we can continue to hear your voice. We've been hearing that folks are really interested in seeing improvements across the community, and we want to explain, how we're trying to solve that for you all, and just kind of emphasize that this is a major goal for the town manager, for the select board, and we're trying to attack it in a few different ways. And so please follow along for updates here. Beyond our podcast series, we have a great newsletter called Concord Currents that just also published an update on some of the projects. So there's a lot of ways to stay connected, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, Jason.